There are moments in life when the hardest part isn't the problem itself. It's not knowing what to do next. You look at the situation from every angle. You think. You pray. You ask questions. You make plans. But nothing feels clear. And the longer you stay there, the heavier everything becomes. Because uncertainty has a way of making you feel powerless. You start thinking you need the whole answer before you can move. You need to know how it will work, when it will change, who will help, what the outcome will be. But maybe that's exactly what's keeping you stuck. Because God doesn't always give you the whole map. Sometimes He gives you one instruction, one direction, one next step. And that next step may look small. It may even look strange. But if it comes from God, it's enough to move you forward. There's a story in Scripture about a woman who reached the point where she had no clear solution left. Her husband was gone. The debt was real. The pressure was closing in, and her children were at risk. She didn't have the luxury of waiting until she understood everything. She needed direction. And what happened next reveals something powerful. God didn't show her the entire solution at once. He showed her what to do next. And if you understand that one detail, it may completely change the way you face the problem in front of you right now. The widow did something many people forget to do when pressure becomes overwhelming. She asked for help, but not just from anyone. She went to the prophet of God. She brought the problem to the place where she could receive direction. That matters, because when life becomes confusing, it's easy to listen to every voice except the one that can actually lead you. Fear speaks. Panic speaks. Other people speak. Your own thoughts become louder. But direction comes when you stop reacting to every voice and start asking, God, what do you want me to do next? Elisha listened to her. Then he asked a question that probably felt almost insulting in that moment. What do you have in your house? She had come because she lacked what she needed, and now he was asking about what she still had. Her answer was simple, almost nothing. Only a small jar of oil. That could have been the end of the conversation. She could have looked at that little jar and said, this isn't enough. But that wasn't the point. God wasn't asking her to solve the problem with what she had. He was asking her to place what she had inside the direction He was giving. And then came the next instruction. Go to your neighbors. Ask them for empty jars. Not a few. As many as you can get. Think about that. The miracle was going to happen inside her house. But first, she had to walk outside and start knocking on doors. That means faith was not passive. She had to move. She had to ask. She had to involve the people around her. She had to take a step that probably made no sense before she saw the result. And maybe that's where someone gets stuck. You're waiting for God to do something, but He may already be telling you what to do next. Call someone. Ask for help. Use what you have. Go somewhere. Start something. Stop something. Take the step. Because sometimes the answer doesn't appear before obedience. Sometimes clarity comes while you're moving, and this widow was about to discover that the next step mattered far more than having the whole plan. She went. Door after door, neighbor after neighbor, and every empty vessel she carried back home was a visible act of faith. She still had the debt. She still had the pressure. Nothing had changed yet. But she was moving in the direction God had given her. That is important, because sometimes obedience looks foolish before it looks faithful. Imagine what the neighbors may have thought. Why do you need all these jars? What are you going to do with them? How will empty containers solve your problem? She didn't have an explanation. She had an instruction, and that was enough. There are moments when you will have to move before you can explain why. You may have to take a step that doesn't impress anyone. A step that looks too small for the size of the problem. But if God gave the direction, don't despise the step. The widow gathered the vessels. Then Elisha told her to go inside, close the door, bring her sons with her, and start pouring. This is where the story becomes even more powerful. The jars were empty. Her house was still simple. The debt was still real. But now everything God had told her to prepare was in place. She had sought direction. She had moved. She had asked for help. She had gathered what was available. And now came the moment she could not control. The pouring. She took the little oil she had and started. One vessel, then another, and the oil kept flowing. What looked too small in her hands became more than enough under God's direction. But notice the order. The oil did not multiply while she was sitting afraid. It multiplied after she had obeyed the next step. And there is one detail here that should stop you for a moment. The oil did not stop because God ran out. It stopped when there were no more vessels left to fill. That means the limit was not in the source. It was in the capacity that had been prepared. And maybe that is the question you need to ask yourself now. Not, do I have the whole answer? But, have I prepared myself for the next step God is asking me to take? There is another reason this story matters. The widow did not solve her crisis alone. God gave the direction. But the vessels came through people. That means sometimes the answer to your prayer is connected to someone already around you. A neighbor, a friend, a family member, a person with experience, someone who can open a door, lend a hand, give advice, make a call, or simply stand with you while you take the next step. Pride can make us believe that asking for help is weakness. Fear can make us think people will judge us. But this woman had no time for pride. She needed vessels. So she knocked. And every door she knocked on became part of the provision. That does not mean every person around you has the answer. They don't. The direction still came from God. But once the direction was clear, she recognized that God could use ordinary people as part of the process. That balance matters. Seek God first. Then pay attention to what and who He may already have placed around you. Because sometimes we pray for a miracle while ignoring the resources standing one door away. The widow did not know which neighbor would say yes. She did not know how many vessels she would receive. She did not know how the oil would multiply. She only knew what to do next, and she kept doing it. That is where many people lose momentum. They take one step. Nothing dramatic happens. So they stop. But obedience is not always one giant moment. Sometimes it is a sequence of small steps. Knock on one door, then another. Carry one vessel, then another. Pour into one jar, then another. And only after enough small acts of obedience do you finally look around and realize, God has been building something much bigger than you could see at the beginning. The widow did not need all the answers. She needed enough faith for the next instruction. And maybe that is exactly what you need right now. Not a complete plan, not a guarantee, not a perfect picture of the future, just enough trust to take the next step. Because the next step can lead you to the next door. The next door can lead you to the next vessel. And the next vessel can become part of the provision you could never have created on your own. And then came the part she had been waiting for. The crisis began to change. The same house that had been filled with fear was now filled with oil. The same woman who had looked at what she had and said, almost nothing, was now surrounded by evidence that God had been working through every step of obedience. But the story still wasn't finished. Because provision is not only about receiving, it is also about knowing what to do with what God provides. She went back to Elisha, and he gave her the final direction. Sell the oil, pay your debt, live on what remains. That matters. God's provision had a purpose. It brought relief. It restored stability. It gave her room to breathe again. And notice something important. She still had a role in the process. She had to sell the oil. She had to pay the debt. She had to manage what remained. The miracle did not remove responsibility. It made responsibility possible again. That is a powerful lesson. Sometimes we ask God to change the situation, and He does. But then He asks us to handle the answer with wisdom, to act, to organize, to follow through, to keep moving. Because faith is not only believing that God can provide, it is also being ready to steward what He places in your hands. The widow's story began with a question she could not answer. How will I get out of this? But God never required her to know the whole answer. He required her to seek direction, then obey it, then keep going. And that is where this story becomes personal. Maybe you are facing something right now that feels too big to solve. Maybe you have been trying to see the entire path before taking one step. Maybe fear has convinced you that if you do not know exactly how everything will work, you should do nothing. But what if God is not asking you for the whole plan? What if He is asking you for the next act of obedience? Maybe the next step is prayer. Maybe it is asking someone for help. Maybe it is making the call you have been avoiding. Maybe it is using something you already have. Maybe it is finally acting on a direction God has been putting on your heart for a long time. You do not have to see the last vessel. You do not have to know how much oil will come. You do not have to understand every detail. You need to know who you are following, and then take the next step. Because when direction comes from God, even a small step can open the door to something you could not see from where you started. Maybe the reason you feel overwhelmed is not because God has given you nothing. Maybe it is because you are trying to carry tomorrow before He has asked you to. You want the full explanation, the full provision, the full guarantee. But God often works differently. He gives enough light for the next step, then the next, then the next, and only later do you look back and understand how the path was forming beneath your feet. The widow never saw the whole process in the beginning. She only knew she had a problem too big for her, so she sought the right voice. She received direction. She moved. She asked for help. She gathered what was available. She obeyed behind closed doors. And God met her there. That is the pattern. Not passivity. Not panic. Direction. Obedience. Movement. Trust. And maybe that is what you need to hear today. You do not need all the answers. You need the next step. If God has already shown you what that step is, take it. If He has not, seek Him until the direction becomes clear. Then move. Do not despise the small beginning. Do not be ashamed to ask for help. Do not ignore the people God may be placing around you. Do not wait for certainty when He has already given you direction. Because the vessel does not need to know how the oil will keep flowing. It only needs to be ready to receive. And you do not need to know how every part of your future will unfold. You only need enough faith to obey what God is asking you to do now. So when fear tells you to freeze, seek God. When confusion tells you there is no way forward, seek direction. When pride tells you to do everything alone, ask for help. When the step feels too small, take it anyway, because one step of obedience can lead to the next, and the next can lead to the provision you could not see from the beginning. You do not need all the answers, just the next step. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and join us as we continue growing in faith, learning to trust God, and taking the next step with Him.